TTT Studio is an online cafe where we discuss emergent theories of reality with a special focus on speculative realism and flat ontologies. We are also focused on developing our own flat ontology with a relational twist that is dubbed simply TTT. In TTT Studio, we navigate the possibilities for a relational ontology based on a dialogue guided by literal things presented each week by one of the participants. The things presented will be available in a picture shown on the left side of the screen. In the description, you can also find an introduction to the main concepts of TTT. This week, Federica will present her visual poem and will guide our discussion about individuality of things, the relationality of things, and how form and content merge together.
Hello. Well, this picture is a visual poem, which means it's a poem made out also of images. And Bruna Pontes and I designed it for a contest of visual poems. We based the idea on an already written poem from a Spanish poet called Paqui Jimenez. The poem is called City, and we realized in the process of creation, in the process of creating the image of the poem, that the form created by the words themselves was already like a shadow of a city, or like the limits of a city. If you could draw a line around all the words composing the poem, you would end up having exactly this kind of image with these surroundings, with these limits, as building itself a poem. So we wanted to show in the image how the poem itself is representing not just in words a city, but also in the form itself. So the content and the form coincide in this poem. And this visual image or visual poem, it's about this coincidence of the form, the material form, and the content, the semantic content. Um, okay, so I leave you to speak about it.
It seems as though the sort of the cityscape drawn over the words emphasizes what is being described, right? Like it's a description of one's place within a city, a certain context, and that's circumscribed by the words themselves being made to look like the silhouette of a city or the inverted silhouette of a city.
Mhm.
Where the person is, though, does it have some significance?
Well, that's not exactly a mention of a person, but it's more like the mention of solitude.
Hmm.
Wait, like Scott asked if the location of the person in the picture, does it have any meaning? The exact location.
Ah, I didn't get the question. No, to be honest, it has a more aesthetical meaning than a, I don't know, another meaning.
And the way that the light and shadow is cast is interesting. Almost as though the city is a lonely place, but it seems to cast light somehow. And there's this one section that's repeated of like without the city without light and loneliness seems to be repeated twice in that diagonal piece. It's almost a little bit like smoke coming out of the city. It makes it seem almost industrial somehow.
Mm.
I think this is what I was curious about because I also have the impression that the words are rising. The intention was that the words are falling into their shape.
I see.
But everybody that has seen it got the same idea that it's like going up instead of coming down.
I wonder why. Because like there is no direction there.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know why. Maybe like we have the, how do you say, like the habit to see, to begin with the most clear thing, because it's like the the lines around it are like clearer, drawn clearer, and maybe we have this tendency to concentrate first there and to think that that is the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we do have, or it does show our tendency to start with concrete things and then our tendency to associate words with abstractness. And I guess it's also aesthetically nice that what is abstract we associate with like an upper axis, something that goes up. It's never something that goes down, right? Like we associate thought and well, yeah, poetry and language generally with something that rises from the world or detaches itself from the world, but it's not something that falls into the world, I guess. And
Maybe if I give the title that I sent to the contest to the image was in the beginning was, I don't know what is the translation of the Bible. In the beginning was the verb or was the word,
The word, I think, is the English translation.
and that's the title. And I wanted that title exactly to emphasize like where is the beginning.
but that's this beginning issue. If we connect it a bit to ontology, it's really interesting how you can, if you start from the word and you end up with the shape of the city and the city in this photo, the actual city, you might think like that reality is some sort of performative process through which, through language, meaning and form is conveyed to the world. But then if you start with the shape, with the line, and then you go to words, you end up to in a more, I don't know if realist, but at least like empiricist standpoint in which you take from the individual things of the world and you build slowly from them words, concepts, representations, and so on. So I think it's a nice. I never thought about it like this, but I think it's a nice confusion there going on of what do we actually do with the world? Are we interpreting it, or are we impregnating it with meaning? What's actually going on in our relation to the
I remember just now there's a topic in the metaphysics of Aristotle exactly about this idea of, on the one side, where is the beginning of something? Where do we begin with normally to get to knowledge, and its relation to what is in itself more knowable? So the relation of what is knowable for us and what is knowable in itself. So what is knowable for us is mostly the things that are easier, and what is knowable in itself is the things that are actually like most difficult. And he makes like a very nice analogy, and he says our eyes I like the eyes of a bat before the light. So we are blind for him for things which are knowable in itself, but we have more eyes for things which are closer to us. So he made this distinction. I hope I was clear. Or maybe with the example here, we have the easiest and immediate thing that we can recognize does not mean that that is the most recognizable thing in itself, that has more knowledge in itself, but it's easier to us. Is from where we grasp something, like the point from which we begin to get to the whole of knowing something. So here actually the words are saying what is the thing, but we tend to see clearer these lines. So these lines are like clearer for us, but the words
are clearer in themselves, something like that, like applying this idea of Aristotle.
But then again, why would the hard thing be more valuable than what we are used to? Like, I understand that what he's going for, that you have to go through this whole process of actually getting beyond the variety of shapes and forms in order to get to an essence of a thing. But why would, like, this from a realist perspective, or the speculative realist perspective, the question, why would we need that? Why would we need to go beyond what is closest to us? Why not stay there and make sense of what is closest to us without assuming that there is something hidden behind that, or something more deep or more uh, valuable than what is given to us, like the light. No, not the light. Like the, I don't know, the shape here.
Well, yes, of course, there's like the presupposition that something is better in the sense that it's like has more to know, like the essence of something. But on the other side, this process, when you, let's say, when you already arrived to the point where you know, this is just like the lines around it, and this is the actual content which I wish to recognize. After that is not anymore hidden, so it's not always hidden, let's say it like that. It's not like when you have a first encounter with something and you encounter it multiple times, then you are you get like used that you thought that was the actual thing wasn't the actual thing, or wasn't the complete thing. Do I how can I say that in other words? Wait.
Yeah, no, I understand now better, and I think so. I think we tend more to agree with the second part, that what was first seen was not the complete thing, right? That you need to go through several stages, or endless stages, before getting close to something like the complete thing. But like, what I'm questioning in Aristotle, not in your poem, is why do we need that? Like, what are his arguments for the necessity of going beyond, like, the first encounter? And also, is is that what we reach after we go beyond that first encounter, something that is, yeah, more valuable in itself, and then constitutes everything that was first encountered? Or is there an equivalence relation between, like, the essence and what we first encountered?
But there, in this case, you have two problems, because one problem is like the first thing we see, because there's also the possibility of essence intuition, for example. So you have there another problem, that it's not necessary the last thing you get to know, but it could be like an intuitive way to know it. So it must not be the first or the last thing, on the one hand. So it's not about exactly like the chronology of knowledge, like the first thing to the last things, if you include intuition as a form of knowledge. The first thing that we encounter is not equivalent, not necessarily equivalent to the first thing in the sense of knowledge. So you have already the presupposition of a hierarchy within knowable things. That is true. So there are, for example, for him, particulars are underneath universals. That's one example. In terms of knowledge, but not necessarily in terms of ontology. That's the situation. So for Aristotle, in terms of knowledge, universals are above particular things. But in terms of existence, particulars are above universal things. And this principle is just related to the process of knowledge. It's not in terms or in existential or ontological terms. So it does not mean necessarily that it's a hierarchy between things, but between the way we know things.
I'm I understand better now, and I remember reading about that. Like Marion uses this argument from Aristotle that the particulars have priority or are more priority in existence, even though epistemologically they're inferior to their causes. Uh, and I like this argument, but you also mentioned this intuition of essence. Is such a thing possible for Aristotle, or was this something that you used more anachronically, let's say from a modern perspective?
It's possible. It's not sure that Aristotle would accept intuition, or it. The problem is if the intuition is possible beforehand every sort of empirical encounter with things. I don't think he would agree that there's the possibility of intuition absolutely free of empirical evidence or empirical or experience. But I don't. I'm. The question is, if already having empirical experience, if it's possible. I think yes. I don't know how to explain, but I think it's possible to imagine that Aristotle would agree with that.
But what is intuition of essence? Because when you said that, I thought that it refers more to the ability of seeing one particular thing and recognizing or seeing in that thing the universal immediately without cognition. That's what I understand under intuition of essence, that you do not need the separation between thinking and sensibility, but that you immediately have access to a universal, to a thing in itself.
Mm. Yeah. I understand. As I said, I'm not sure if it's possible for Aristotle, but the concept as such of a sort of thing that would be intuition exists. How does it work? I'm not sure. But the idea, there's like the discursive way of approaching things or the empirical way of abstracting from different particulars one universal. That would be like a discursive thinking, but there's also what he calls the noetical thinking. So this would be the discursive, would be the dianoetical, and the noetical would be a sort of immediate recognition. But how does this immediate recognition work? I have no idea.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. If, like, that noetic level, if it exists. Okay. How how does like neuroscience see this? How do beings normally approach things in terms of individuals and in terms of particulars and universals? Is this distinction being made in neuroscience?
Yes. I think there's several axes on which you could describe that. There's a sense in which if you look more posterior, like if you're looking at a visual scene, if you look more posterior, you'll see that individual neurons tend to represent components of the thing. So like the vertical lines will cause some visual cortex neurons to fire in a certain way. And then like the idea of more complex relations between that image and other things. So is it of a type? So does it represent a number or a symbol or things like that? Then that essentially occurs as you go more anterior in the broadest senses. But like it does seem as though like mice can process threat at the level of the retina. So they can like, that doesn't even need higher processing than that sometimes for looming stimulus. So something's like coming down upon them. The gestalt of the looming threat is apparently, I haven't actually read this paper, I just saw the headline, so I don't really know how to talk about it, but is processed in retinal cells. So in some sense, that gestalt is present from the earliest levels of processing, which I think would be something like the noetic intuition that you were describing, in that some fundamental aspect of the situation that the animal faces is known kind of instantly. But whether it's what its form is, what its trajectory is, I don't know if that's. I imagine that's represented much more later parts of the processing stream. So either like in visual or in more frontal regions. For the most part, though, I think we do tend to also use the context from prior moments to have a pretty good picture of what we see now. So like one is not just generally confronted with an object. I think this gets a little bit to like why minimalism is interesting and stuff like this, which is that like if you walk into an art gallery, you sort of have the sense you're in an art gallery, and you sort of know that you will then perceive things in terms of art. This is a little bit like what I think Razvan talks about also with Marion, in that like the frame determines some aspect of the image you will see, and some sort of way of approaching it. Its details will be processed via like the normal visual process of little bits to larger bits. But there's some sense in which you're in an art gallery looking at a picture in a frame that determines those details of processing. I'm not sure that was a very coherent answer to your question.
But I remember just shortly, do you remember that we had a discussion? I don't remember the details, but about Puya's work and the perception of the quantities. And as I remember, I'm not sure, it was something similar. It was like I thought like normally we think of quantities as abstractions, like we abstract like the children learn the numbers. First you have to show the fingers, 1, 2, and then you start like to abstract from the things and the number of things to these more abstract forms of quantities. And the animals, as I understood Puya's point, somehow intuit the quantity. They don't have to go through the process of we have here 2 bananas and then we have number 2, but they just see like number 2 is danger and number 1 is nice or something like that.
There's this thing called subitizing, which is different to counting. So that like there's savants who can subitize with very high numbers of things, but essentially they know the quantity on site rather than by counting it.
Yeah.
So with Puja's stimulus, they're always balanced on the amount of sort of luminant pixels on the screen, but they vary in their number. So if you have 4 circles, it'll be the same size as 2 circles. But what is different is their borders. So like in some senses, so in that case, the animals seem to be able to represent quantity pretty well. Their neurons seem to be tuned to that quantity, but it's not clear if it's like, it seems to be more about that subitizing thing, which is that the animals know that there's, well, if there's a high number, that there was 49 or 50, right? In her case, it's whether it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 0 or 8 or whatever. But I think this noetic intuition would be looking at like a cloud of 50 dots and knowing there's 50, or at least knowing when you look at the next cloud of dots and there's 47, that there's less, and you have a sort of a a general sense of that quantity. And the more abstract thing, we just sort of go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then count the individual one. Like in some senses, the visual poem here does sort of part of that. I don't know if it's some form of weird cross-modal thing like subitizing, but when you see it, you're sort of like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to be reading a poem about a city, right? Or a factory or a building. Like the process we would go through to read the words would be scanning like our eyes across each word, understanding them, and then slowly building up a picture. And for most poems, you'd have to read it several times to perhaps develop like a full mental image of it. But you sort of do the work for them here, right? Like there's a person, there's a city. Your perspective is sort of looking from the window upon the city. You're a small part of it. It sort of creates the gestalt before the details.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's useful actually, because though, like I imagine if there was some empirical test of your poem, just the words versus your poem and the image, on one reading, people's impression would probably be would be more similar for the people who looked at the image versus just the words. Like the way the words fall into the structure is also sort of the cognitive process that's going on. You're being constrained and sort of pushed in a particular direction on how to perceive what is being said just by the first glance at it.
Like making the content immediately accessible.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least guiding your journey with the poem, because like the content is not immediately present. It's mediated visually and conveyed in a more intuitive manner, but you still have to go through the whole process of realizing that the words are falling into their shape, right? That augments somehow the way you perceive the poem. But like what I'm trying to say is they determine themselves, or they augment each other or highlight each other reciprocally. It's not that you have it at first sight, or you have it without interacting or in getting yourself involved with the poem. It's more that there's more there to work with.
Yeah, the beholder's share is still as present, I think. It's not as though, like as you always point out, that there's infinite possible relations. So it's not as though the space of possibilities is necessarily reduced. It's just that you explore that from a different vantage point.
For me, it's actually increased the horizon of possibilities, because going through a poem, I'm determined by my experiences with poems, right? I go through the poem and then I get something. But here, it seems to me that it challenges me more, because I don't know where to start. First and foremost, right? I'm lost at the beginning. I'm also confronted with perspective that is not normally present in a poem, which is visual perspective. And I'm also confronted with the question about the relation between all of the individual words, but also their redoubling, their shading, and their relation with the shapes around them. So, for me, just like a movie, for example, it's like, but I do get what you guys are saying, because there is this sort of duality there, that because it has more elements that all converge together to give you this one feeling, which you probably or maybe receive more impactful than just reading a poem. Like, consider adding music to it, and also a really impactful voice that can recite it really well. Then it hits maybe more powerful. So this is like the immediate aspect to it, but then it also increases the possibility of interpretation because you have multiple aspects joining in into the gestalt of the poem. So I guess it's, for me, it's a nice play that increases the intuitivity of what is being presented, but by that also urges you to make more sense of it, like to search more, to look beyond the usual experience of a poem.
Yeah, the point was that we normally think we should read a poem, right? No, that is obvious. But I was like seeing the poem and I thought, no, you should perceive, not just like read, but perceive like the form of the words. What are the lines that create the whole group of words? So I saw the poem as a group, like a whole thing, without like going through each letter and the meaning of each word, but looking at it in its body, like looking at the body of the poem. And I discovered exactly like that it had this exactly the form, which is this at the same time the content. And that is what I loved about this poem, that it had this double being. At the same time the content reflects a city, and the form of the way it is written, like the material part of the poem, has also a content or a meaning.
This reminds me a bit of well, what Scott was saying about Marion, but also about Kant and his concept of aesthetical ideas. And aesthetical ideas are, well, for him, are mostly intellectual, but they are also representations of totalities, in which you are confronted with a representation, in this case, let's say the poem, the visual poem, that shows you that what you think of it and what your image of it is always incomplete. So what your approach to the poem is always is always short of the totality of the meaning that can be found there. So an aesthetical idea for Kant is something that represents totalities by their absence in thought, so by their inability to be cognized. And that urges you to wonder at them. And wonder is this like this state of our minds of being confronted with an endless array of possibilities, but not feeling like that endless array of possibilities is chaotic. So being confronted with some sort of excess, but at the same time seeing in it some sort of logic or some sort of like knowing that there is something to this endlessness of possibilities. And I remembered, I'm sorry if I talk too much, but I remembered about a scene described by Heisenberg when he was describing a walk in the mountains, and that there was a lot of fog around them, but he could see the the outline of the mountains they wanted to reach. And he was saying that that's how he felt when discussing with his traveling party, about quantum theory, and they were at the initial stages of formulating the theory, and that they felt the same way about the theory itself, that everything was in fog, but they could see the shape of it, so they would know it's there, even though they had no like formalized content. So there's again this duality of having this immediate idea, there is something there, but not yet formalized, not yet actualized as a concrete theory or as a concrete interpretation.
A little bit like a tip of the tongue phenomena. where you know the thing you're trying to say, like you have a knowledge of it. You could almost describe the area around the word or the name or whatever it is, but you can never actually find the details for some reason.
But I think what I'm trying to describe is the opposite, that you have no knowledge of what you're talking about, but you have the intuition of having the knowledge.
Yeah, no, I think that's also what I mean. Yeah, like you sort of you feel like you know, but you can't say what that knowledge is or give any description of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, this is useful because this is how I think about the difference between situational thing and thing. Like the thing, the endless thing, is is what escapes the possibility of saying it. You know, like it's there. You see the outline of it in the situational thing, but it's not the entirety of it there. It's not the entirety of it present there. You know, so there's this kind of like intuition about it, about the what escapes what is actually present in the situation, which can be cognized and formalized and whatever. But at the same time, there is this duality that says not everything that you're saying about the situation is being said. Like there is always something that goes beyond what you're saying, or extends beyond what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. In that, how will I describe an example of this? Like a situation becomes more like a thing whenever it's detailed. So you can be within a situation that could be like I don't know, like a sense of foreboding or sinisterness or these various or this sort of like general cloud of feelings. But once you describe its boundaries, what are the causes within that situation of the various feelings, etc., etc., it becomes something you can circumscribe and then generalize about. Right? There's a sense of foreboding that is similar before a job interview or before having a wisdom tooth removed, or like there's a sort of a weird cloud of a state there. But when you start to detail its components, each of those things become a thing, or each of those things is thought of as a thing that you can then generalize and look for similar things elsewhere. Right? Is that
No, I
related?
think I didn't make myself clear then, because this continues to be a confusion in terms, because thing is is more like the awareness of something being out there, which is not fully circumscribed, no matter how much I detail. So what I can say in detail in a situation will never be enough to describe the entirety of what is involved in that situation and is also related to other situations. So when, let's say, in this situation in the poem, right, we start with a word with no light, let's say. That's how this discussion started. And you started with a remark about it, then I added to it, and we entered into this discussion that led us to like endless relationalities. We can still go on and expand it and extend it. And there is a sense of that thing making sense to us in each situation and in each relations it has. But there is also the sense about the thing being more than what we are saying about it. So there's this duality of you being able to cognize certain aspects of the thing based on the situation present, but there's also the second feeling, let's call it feeling, that no matter how much we say about it, there will still be more to be said about it.
But do you mean then the relation between language and the things?
No, I'm using this as a metaphor to explain how in TTT we refer to situational thing and endless thing. The situational thing is that possibility of describing, in our scenario right now, the word seen loose in multiple relations and meanings. And the endless thing is the awareness that there's always more to be said about it. Not so the possibilities of saying something about seen loose are not exhausted by what we said until now.
Ah,
So there's more to be unfolded there. You know, it's something that never stops giving, let's say. But it nevertheless gives. Like it nevertheless is present to us. We can say it has a white color, it has shape, it has this relation with shading and so on and so forth. But we can go on endlessly and add to it like the implications of, I don't know, the development of the language and its relation to Indo-European and non-Indo-European languages, let's say, and all of the history that led to the usage of that word, and so on and so forth. Like we say with the knowledge that there's more to say.
But you can are you saying that the situational thing is fully exhaustible by you? Like you can fully describe the situational thing, but then there will always be more things to say about the endless thing? Or are you saying that also the situational thing is not never possible to fully describe?
I'm saying more the latter. So I'm saying we can say things about the situational things, and that in that situation, sometimes what we say can be sufficient to make sense of the situation, but it's never making sense of the entirety of the thing.
But you
Because the
can make
thing,
sense of,
hmm?
you can make sense of the entirety of the situation.
uh, it's for
Because
me
I mean,
like that also depends on what what means to make sense of the entirety of the situation, because I feel like that's a bit arbitrary in the sense that sufficiency is dependent on what we seek in the situation, right? Like,
but we can define the situation, no? Like you can say, I want to consider the situation Earth and Sun modeled as 2 points in space, and I want to consider only the relation that they have in space,
yeah,
and then you
no,
measure it,
you can,
and
you can, yeah,
that's the situation, no?
you can, yeah, of course. But just like because a situation is an interaction between things, let's say, then there's also more to be added into that situation. You can expand that situation.
But then
More
it's a
and more
different
and more.
situation. Then it becomes a different situation, or it's still the same situation. Because then I wouldn't see, like, I don't see where the limit between thing and situation is. If you can always expand the situation, then it becomes a thing, no?
Yeah, I
You're,
haven't thought about that, if it's a different situation or not. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, then it would probably be a different situation. I'm not sure if you can exhaust a situation.
I think by definition, the way I understand it, situations are finite. No, that's the
Yeah,
difference.
yeah, of course, yeah.
So then potentially you could exhaust any situation if you have enough uh,
Yeah.
relation
The, what?
thinking
Yeah.
abilities.
What I'm trying to say is that so when you circumscribe a situation and define every element inside it, that that process of describing and identifying and isolating everything in that situation is a process that also forebode that what is inscribed in that situation is not exhausted by that situation. So I want to highlight this duality of each flattening process or each abstraction process, that you abstract a word from a poem precisely because that word is not exhausted by your abstraction process, which would be a situation, let's say. So does that make sense? Just like a limit, right? When you put a limit, when you circumscribe something which is inside, but because you put that limit, that also implies that there is something outside of that situation.
But what do you mean with that something? I don't understand.
Other situations. From which you delineate something.
So, well, but so you agree with Jaime, right?
I'm not sure on what.
I was asking a question, so I guess.
No, on the idea before of the difference between thing and situation, and there's a limit to the situation.
Yes, no. So a situation is finite. What I'm trying to highlight here is that each finitude in the situation forebodes an endlessness of non-situational things.
You just want to use this word.
Is it clear what I'm trying to say?
Not entirely.
I mean, the way I... No, go ahead, Scott.
No, not entirely. I think it was
okay. The way I understand it is that you're saying that, but it's kind of the definition of thing and situational thing. No, you are saying each time you consider a situational thing, you know that there is a thing that goes farther than situation.
Yes, that's the whole thing I wanted to say.
Like, so this conversation is a situation, right? This is a situation we're all in.
Yes,
but it's also a thing.
It is also a thing.
Of course.
But I guess I'm trying to think of a way of like I know that one can describe a thing as a thing and a situation as a thing and vice versa. Like they're not fully exclusive concepts, right?
But I would insist on the difference, at least on a discursive level, between situation and thing. Otherwise, it's all confusing. Like, of course, they're all interconnected and can be this situation. We can see it under the scope of all of the factors that have influenced the way we speak about the poem, and then the situation also becomes some sort of thing like endless array of elements and relations. But discursively, it is easy to refer to a situation in this limited sense and to a thing as the broader scope of each of us involved in this situation.
I have a strange question. I'm not sure if it makes sense. But in the case of situations that they are finite, when you have finite situations, you can distinguish one from another. But when you have an infinite thing, how can you speak of many things? How can you distinguish one thing from another? How can you have unity? Do you have unity of a thing, even though it is sort of infinite? Do I make myself clear in my question?
Yes. So I
often think of the infinite hotel in this. I don't know if you guys encountered like there's a type of modeling. There's an infinite Chinese restaurant form of modeling, I think, and there's like an infinite hotel. It's kind of a sort of a problem. But like in the infinite hotel, you have infinite rooms filled with infinite people, and like there's infinite people arriving. So your hotel is never full because you have infinite rooms.
Mm-hmm.
There's already infinite people there, but more people can stay in the hotel because there's infinite rooms. But but each room is a room, you know. So you could enter one of those rooms that would be different from another one. So the infinitude aspect, you can spend time at the hotel and you can visit people in 20 rooms, or you could visit people in 20 different rooms or 400 different rooms or whatever. So that there's infinite possibility of relating to the hotel via visiting different rooms and meeting different people in them.
And like the uniqueness of that configuration of relations you have with the endless possibilities in the hotel makes you unique also and individual.
And if the thing is the hotel, like if you visit people in rooms 1, 20, 17, and 26, each time, assuming those people haven't left, which they might, but if they're still there, you will still interact with those aspects of the hotel thing, even though there's a great deal of space to interact with other residents in the hotel.
I have.
Hmm?
No, I was going to say that I have more trouble with the point we were talking about before, that the infinity part, I think it's easier for me to grapple with, but the human situations are very tricky for me to think as, like, to consider the boundary between the situational things, the situational humans and the thing humans, because I don't find any criteria to say which relations are influencing my presence in this situation and which ones are not. And that's, I mean, I can think of it as the situation is finite, but it's too big for me to think. Like, I can't consider all the relations that are forming, that are participating in this situation, because it's just too big, but it's still a situation because it's not infinite. But at the same time, I find it conceptually difficult to even accept that there is such boundary, that there are relations that are part of me but are not influencing this situation somehow.
No, I wouldn't say that they're not influencing it. They, in each situation, like all of the relationalities involved, influence each other. Like there is no clear border between situations. They're more like liquids, right? You have interaction there, also between
But it
situations.
depends on how you define the situation. No? If you define a very, very simple situation, like I was saying before, like I have two imaginary or two real things in space, and I want to calculate the center between the distance between their centers, and I define that as the situation, that's the distance between those two things or objects or situational things. Then there is only one relation that's important in that situation. No? It's just the physical distance between the two objects. But then if I take a situation like a human conversation, like I would have, like, even if I describe it as is the conversation that we are having at this point in time about this topic in this Zoom meeting in blah blah blah, still it seems impossible to me to kind of separate any characteristics of any one of us from the situation.
Yeah, no, I
My,
agree, and of course there are different complexities of situations. But like we also have to consider that it is possible to abstract, and we do that all the time. We interact. I mean, I abstract from all of the past of your person that I don't know, for example, when I'm talking to you, and you often do that too. But I do agree that, and I think this is a key point, that a situation is, especially situations in like social contexts or any situation that is not of hypothetical nature, involves a multitude of factors which maybe uh, are are too numerous to be counted or to be taken into account at each step. So I would agree with that. Maybe I just thought about this. It's maybe you could say that a situation can also be endless, but it's a countable infinity, like the I don't know, the set of natural numbers, which is countable, right? There are sets of infinite countable elements that you could like hypothetically be able to count all of them, and there are uncountable infinities, like the set of real numbers, which each distance between each number is also an infinity, and therefore you would have to count several infinities in order to count the whole set. So I would say that the situation can be endless, but it's a countable endlessness, and the thing is never countable. Like there is no one situation in which you can count the whole thing, the whole aspect of a thing.
I I like the sound of that, but I'm not fully convinced. I think I have a hard time thinking about infinities in general.
It was pure
Like I don't.
speculation. I also have.
Another aspect of my same question. So I understood very well how Scott put the hotel example, but maybe what I meant or I is more like when you speak of infinite in the sense that there's no a limiting outline. For example, you have the rooms, but they are defined somehow. I mean, they have a physical outline that you can say this is one room, this is the other. So my question would be, in which sense it is infinite? Because do things have outlines? They have like something that limit them and so distinguish them from one another. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. In that, if I understand you, I think what an example, like there's various different ways one object can relate, or one thing. Sorry, I don't want to go into the wrong ontology. One thing can relate to another. It might be via like olfaction, vision, touch, etc. Like there's those types of relations it can have. It can have them over time, and they're kind of like rooms or people in rooms. It's not clear which, but those are not necessarily fully independent, but they're sort of separate relations that we can in principle describe, and the hotel could be filled with those different relations. So it's like inside each room is a relation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for example, you have the room itself have infinite possibilities. So it's infinite in the sense of a virtuality. That is what I mean. A virtuality of being in different infinite encounters, of being seen by different persons, of being hosting different people, of being cleaned, of being slept on, whatever. In that sense is what you mean with infinity related to things, like the virtuality of their possibilities, the infinite virtuality.
Yeah.
So I think this is an issue if we think of individuality as delineating yourself physically from something else, right? Like this kind of individuality is what is defended by empiricists often, which individuality is constituted by your borders in space and time. But another way of thinking about individuality is based on uniqueness. And this is where phenomenology can be of use, especially when phenomenology talks about events which are not clearly determined in space and time as unique, because you have events, multiple events happening at the same time and in the same place, but that doesn't make them unique. What makes them unique is the way all of the relations that are involved in that event configure themselves. So how that event comes to be, right? So you could say the same thing about endless things, that what makes them individual is not their borders, but their uniqueness of configuration, relational configuration. Maybe like, I don't know, like a fingerprint. You have uniqueness in pattern there, which can be used as a metaphor for uniqueness in configuration of relations without making use of borders. So it's, if you increase the number of relations to an endless set, and you allow for a unique configuration based on all of the events that have been, or all of the situations that have been experienced, then you can explain the individuality of a thing based on its uniqueness of relational patterns. It doesn't have to be a physical borderline between one thing and another. It's more about how that thing lives out its life. or lives out its existence. That's what makes it unique.
Yeah, I think I see that